Welcome to the second instalment of the Agents Journal 3-part series about the housing crisis. In this episode, I'm joined by Rhys Brown. Rhys, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking planning policy, bit of local government and its effect on the housing crisis. But before we get into that, can you give our listeners just a sense for who you are, what you do, both in life and work, and just a bit about your background?
Yeah, so I've got a background in politics. I left university and got involved in political campaigning locally here in Leicester and Leicestershire, but kind of needed a career as well alongside that, really. I've always enjoyed local government, and that's something I've really been passionate about since university.
Mm-hmm.
And the planning system and planning applications is always something that's interested me on both sides of the kind of narrative in terms of housing and what we need and what we don't need. And so at Cavendish, we help developers work with communities and alongside politicians to get and develop the infrastructure and the housing and the retail stores that people need locally, to help developers through the planning system, which I'm sure we'll get to, which can be really complicated, but in a community cohesive way, which sometimes can be really, really difficult.
And where does your interest in politics come from? Like, was that from kind of your influences from school or family, or what kind of drew you into that?
I grew up in a fairly working class area of Sheffield, and I kind of saw a lot of the problems that both local and national governments kind of didn't help people with. And I always thought that, things don't have to be like this necessarily growing up. Neither of my parents were particularly political, but I think it was that injustice of kind of the forgotten, what turned out to be kind of the red wall, I guess, back in the 2019 general election. And that really kind of pushed me into getting involved in, I guess, student politics back at university, and then the proper stuff, if you like, afterwards, which I do still enjoy. And I think is that kind of that passion of actually things don't need to be like this that really does get my blood boiling, and I'm passionate to kind of get things change.
Yeah. So with Cavendish then, could you tell us a little bit more about the business in general and really the problems that you're trying to solve as a business for developers that you're working with?
Yeah, so we're a national company. We've now got offices in all of the countries across the United Kingdom. We have a Midlands-based team as well who help clients across the Midlands, both West and the East Midlands. And we really work with clients on any kind of housing, infrastructure, retail project that they're wanting to get through the planning system, however small or however big. Our main kind of task, if you like, is making sure that what the developer is wanting to pose and wanting to get through planning is not going to be sticky at any point in that process. Now, in a perfect world, that's brilliant. Obviously, stickiness in a planning process, which is very complicated, is common. So it's working alongside the community to make sure that there is content as content can be, but then also working alongside the politicians, whether it's the councillors or even the Member of Parliament, who can be very tricky from time to time. And now with the regional devolution mayors, those people as well and those bodies as well, to make sure that the planning system is as easy as possible from a political and community perspective, because developers have got to get the policies and the development rights from a policy perspective as well, we take care of the community stuff so that really the developers can focus on the policy and making sure that that's all correct.
Could you give us a taste for some of what that means in practice? Like, is there any particular challenges that come to mind that you've assisted clients with that have resulted in a big success? Like, just a sense for the journey that you take the client on.
Yeah, I've worked on a scheme in Rutland actually, which was really, really complicated and really, really big. And we took that scheme from a really large scheme that was rejected at planning and really brought the community into the process, made it a bit smaller to start with, knowing that we'd go back for the other areas of the scheme. So took a part of the scheme and made the community champion that scheme, work out what actually they would like to see within those kind of body of new houses, and really help that community champion and open their eyes to actually, this isn't dreadful, and it really can work to help us as a community. So we managed to get a shop in there, we managed to get a park, a playground, and the community actually went in the end, fair enough. That is really...
So is that about giving community a sense of control then, and or the feeling of that their thoughts and concerns are being addressed?
Yeah, it's making them feel like they have a say, and that their area is their area and their community, and it's not about, we're coming to put 500 houses next door or whatever that may be. And really, we do want to listen to what you've got to say, because nobody knows a community better than the people that live there. And I think, 9 out of 10 developers across the country are really open to that and actually want to get involved in the local community that they're investing in. And the community really open up actually when you start talking to them.
So moving on to the planning process then, obviously the Agent's Journal is a podcast primarily geared at estate agents, but it covers the whole of the property industry really. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this mini-series is to provide some education and some context around other facets of the property industry that affect estate agents. And generally speaking, unless you're an estate agent who deals with a lot of land sourcing and selling new build stock, you don't really have much interaction with the planning system. So I think it'd be really helpful if you could give a bit of an overview about the current process. And we'll look at the current one before we discuss potentially how that's going to change in the coming years. But perhaps an overview of it and some of the challenges it presents and some of the common issues for housing developers.
Yeah, definitely. I think we live in a country with a very complicated planning system, a planning system that was set up to try and give the community, politicians, a say in what happens in their area, but is actually meant with, a lack of government investment in local councils and people understanding the system very, very well, that it's become very, very complicated. And we work with developers who do all of the right things, from a pre-application advice. So that's going to the officers and asking, this is what we want to propose. This is what we want to put a planning application together for. What do you think? The officers then are supposed to reply and give you, this is really what we think. This is policy compliant. This is where you need to go to make sure you are policy compliant, that sort of thing. We then work with the developers through the community consultation perspective and making sure that actually the community are somewhat on board with this, or at least the community feel like they've had a say. And then the application is submitted, and at that point the officer then gives a recommendation. I'm talking in ideal terms here.
Yeah.
And usually if you've been through a pre-app, the officer, so long as you've done everything that the officers said at the pre-application advice, then usually you get an officer recommendation for approval. That then goes to a planning committee made up of local councillors, some of which may have colleagues with an interest in the site, and that can be then very, very tricky. And I've worked on many schemes where you've done all of the right things. You've got an officer recommendation for approval, and then it's not approved. It's rejected at planning committee, principally because the community are kicking up a fuss, or the politicians don't like it, or it's not popular within their residents. So we live in a very kind of complicated but democratic system. And like I kind of said at the start of that, we've got, with the government and what the government is investing in or not investing in, councils are really stretched. You've got, in some kind of authorities, planning authorities, you've got 1.5 officers per authority, at a full-time rate. So we've got all these applications going in. We're supposedly in a housing crisis that, the politicians are talking about, but we can't get the applications through quick enough because there's not the staff, there's not the resources to get them through that system that's very, very complicated.
And does every planning application end up going to committee, or how much autonomy do planning officers have to make decisions? And is that dependent on the size, or?
It depends on a number of factors, including the council, the size of the site, even the number of kind of complainants, the number of objectors, the size of what you're trying to develop. Like if it's a small site but a very tall scheme, then you'll end up at planning. So it kind of depends, but it's kind of down to the officers really. But then it can be called in by the councillors or the leadership of the council as well.
And obviously, we've spoken a little bit earlier on about community engagement. But when it reaches a committee to make a decision, you mentioned that most of the time it's dealing with kind of potential unrest in the local community. Is that the most common reason for then a planning application to be declined?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a policy compliant application, which they're not all, but if it's a policy compliant application, then I guess the most popular reason for rejection is something that is difficult for the developer to understand, and we then get down with kind of the next phase of planning application, which is going to the planning inspectorate to appeal the refusal, which is very costly. And I'm sure some of your listeners have watched Clarkson's Farm, for example, and that showed kind of step by step the planning system at all its failures and some of the situations that developers are put in, unaffordable situations that the developers are put in.
And I think the Clarkson's Farm example is a really good example of how I suppose the simplicity is needed in the process, because there could be things that are like genuine concerns to the local community, or things that could bring economic prosperity and opportunities to the local area where the process gets in the way of progress. Would you say that's fair?
I think one of my biggest criticisms of both the current system and possibly what the government have proposed, which I'm sure we'll come on to, is that we just need a bit of common sense. Yeah. We just need to basically, this is not awful. Politicians stop spinning everything up because it's useful for your next campaign, whenever that may be. And just understand that actually this is the problem, this is the solution. And I think that's really, as a country, where we need to get to. And the more people try and spin, the more people try and use planning for their own advantage, the more these problems that we have as a country will continue.
Well, let's move on to talking about the future then. And Labour's housing targets. Obviously, they've set out a target of building 1.5 million homes over the course of this Parliament. These sort of housing targets seem to be a bit of a political football that lacks any long-term strategy. Like, even obviously ministerial positions are relatively short-term, but like previous housing ministers have been changed more than any other department, from what I understand, and over the Conservative governments. So it seems that across the political spectrum, there lacks a genuinely long-term vision. And actually, to deliver it, I think it is going to take a 10 to 20 year mindset, isn't it? Do you think the Labour government have got that longer term mindset? And also, are they going to hit the 1.5 million homes?
Yeah, I think, well, I will kind of start that by looking at the past. I mean, the Conservative government that we just left power delivered 1 million homes in the last Parliament. So, put into perspective, this Labour government is rhetoric is all about growth, then yes, potentially that's 1.5 million at that point is achievable. But with a very, very complicated planning system, with, we've got a lot of so-called NIMBYs around the country, we've got developers big kind of top 10 developers sat on land and not kind of developing the land that maybe they could. And, soaring costs across the planning sector. We've got huge problems. And although the government's kind of new framework is set out to make the system cheaper, more affordable, simpler, potentially won't go as far enough as we could to get out of, I think, what everyone would at this point describe as a housing crisis.
So let's say if reforms achieve what they hope to achieve with the changes in the planning process, would building 1.5 million homes solve the housing crisis? Or do you think it's a bigger issue that has other facets to it that aren't being considered in their strategy?
Yeah, I think the way we live as humans has changed over the past 40 years. And once upon a time, people would stay in the house with their kind of parents and grandparents and whatnot. And we're much more independent-minded now than we were back then. So people are wanting to go off, live on their own, get a house with a partner, etc., etc. So I think that's one of the reasons where housing has become much more of a commodity and the pricing is shot up because it's much more in demand, and we live in a kind of demand cycle country for this. So yes, I don't see if we build 1.5 million homes, that's the end of the crisis. We never need to think about it ever again. I think it will be a continuous problem in this country until either A, the planning system changes, or B, the way we work as a country changes. And I'm not sure, to be fair, which will happen first.
Yeah. Well, it's we speak to a lot of developers about the sort of challenges that they're up against, and planning is, I mean, it always comes up. So yeah, you can't dispute that. But what I have found interesting is just the other challenges that they're presented with, actually finding feasible sites, and the cost of land, and aging workforces as well, like across the construction sector. There's all of these things that, and the shortage of labour. Like I was talking to one developer who they had I think they got up to plastering basically across 14, 15 houses. And then they just got offered another job somewhere else. And there's no, because the contractors and the way that I suppose the construction set up and working as a main contractor with subcontractors, they don't hold any power. And suddenly the whole project grinds to a halt, and they can't find anyone else to fill their space.
I think moving away from housing for a second, one of the other problems that we face as a country is that at some point in the last 20 to 25 years, it became unpopular and not trendy enough to get a skill, to get a trade. So we've got a severe lack of tradesmen across the sector, and people not wanting to get involved in the sector as well. It's much more on trend to go to university and study a course that actually you don't end up using at university than it is to leave school at 16, 18 and get a trade. So I think that's another problem that we need to really face as a country. I mean, the past government did a lot of work on this, and I think this government is wanting to devolve this issue much more so that the regional mayoral system, that I think we'll touch in a moment, can actually control what they need in their local areas and really gain the skills and push for all the skills in their local areas so that each area actually has a bit of a specialism or at least is gaining the skills that they need in that area.
Yeah.
Yes, is the right approach from a more of a regional perspective.
And with the number of houses that are going to be built, one thing that's apparent to me is that the top 10 house builders are building something like 70-75% of the total number of new build properties. And the majority of them, or I think all 10, I don't actually know, I need to check, but are publicly owned businesses. So with priorities that lie with shareholders, so obviously their output is going to be optimized by maximum shareholder value and profit. So if they're looking to increase their output, or we need to build maybe twice as many new houses, or not quite, but not far off, as we're doing at the minute. Where do you think that? Do you have any insight into where they plan for that shortfall to come from? Is it going to be incentivizing smaller builders, or incentivizing the bigger builders to do it, or does the state need to step in?
I think a bit of all of the above, really. I think the government doesn't have a view on this necessarily. It's not something that the government is looking at dealing with, which I think you're right, is a problem that probably needs solving soon. I think what the government is trying to do is stop this land banking problem, and it is primarily big developers, but I think people across the sector are probably guilty of it as well. And I think that is a problem that we have as a country is this land banking and buying sites, buying bits of spare land, especially brownfield sites, and then not developing them, or not even seeking to develop them, and just waiting for the prices to rise. So I think that's one of the problems that the government is genuinely trying to find a solution for. Not that it has found the solution in the new framework, but councils have the powers pretty much they need at the moment to stop that happening. But the problem being is that councils are so stretched that we're talking about, that the councils aren't going to take one of these top 10 developers to court over this.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, that they've not got the financial willpower to do that. Whereas the developers, as you've just said, are all shareholder led, and they do
have other priorities. It's a matter of you can only do so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it is a problem that has been noted, I'm sure, by government, but they need to come up with a creative solution to really fix that. And at the moment, I don't see a creative solution that will fix that problem at all. And I guess it comes back to the 1.5 million homes. Yes, we may get there by the skin of our teeth, but is that solving the problem that we all know exists, or is it just ticking a box, in a political campaign? I'm not sure.
Talking about political campaigning, something that we started to hear a lot more about in the general election campaign was grey belt. Could you just explain to the listeners a little bit about what grey belt is and what that means, how they're classifying grey belt over green belt?
Yeah, I think there's some more to come on this from the Housing Secretary, but primarily it means the reclassification of greenbelt lands that we all know isn't really very green and may not have been developed on, but is also certainly not beautiful, and is something you open your curtains in the morning and look forward to seeing. It's that kind of site that lives in the middle of brown and green, really, which I think we all know exists across everywhere where we live. We will see, I think, that reclassified, and whether it ends up being called grey or something else, we will see. But I mean, we've seen in Leicester and Leicestershire the local plans that have been developed across the districts and the city authorities have showed that we have severe lack of brown belt land to develop on. And we've seen the local plan, for example, in Leicester has got swathes of parks, playgrounds, etc., that the council is having to suggest as sites for planning because they can't find brown belts in the city. The county politicians are then moaning that the need for housing is being passed into the county, and then the countryside is then being developed on as well. So it is a huge issue that local authorities have, and hopefully this kind of reclassification of some of the more disgusting green belt will be really helpful for that. But it's a wait and watch brief at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, one of my next questions is going to be about this. Like, a lot of the discussion around new developments at the moment seems to be that then more rural communities are kind of disproportionately affected. And you see some cities having their housing targets reduced, whereas rural communities massively increased. Do you think there's a political agenda behind that, or is it more what you've just described about just sheer lack of availability of suitable sites?
Yeah, I think there will be a political kind of brief behind it, of course. I mean, you've got a Labour government at the moment that primarily in the cities across the country, albeit they've just won a stonking majority, so they have actually got county seats. But their bread and butter is across the cities and towns. So it's much easier for a Labour government to actually say, we need to build in the countryside rather than in these cities, because you're going to upset the people in the countryside rather than the city.
Yeah.
So that's kind of bread and butter politics, I guess.
Yeah.
But also, I think until this, we see what the reclassification ends up being for green, grey, brown belt sites, we have got a lack of suitable sites when councils have policies that restrict building in city centres, for example. If you look, for example, in Leicester, there isn't any huge skyscrapers or anything being built in Leicester city centre because the council stops that happening. So when you're not doing that, you have to then kind of spread out of the city centre into the more community-based areas of Leicester. And when there's no space there, then that stretches even further into the county. And I think that those two things together mean that actually the county is getting the brunt end of this, whether it being housing or whether it being kind of clean energy as well, which is we all know it's on its way, whether it being solar farms, etc. The countryside communities are seeing a massive change in what they're calling home.
Going off on quite a bit of a tangent here, but obviously a very hot topic at the moment is immigration. And there seems to be a discussion around the levels of net migration and whether the number of new houses is going to be sufficient if it carries on in at the same sort of rate. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because it seems that the obviously that debate is pretty polarizing, and I always think with things like this, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And maybe you've got some thoughts around the pros and cons of that and what the implications are.
Yeah, I mean, from a political perspective, of course, with so many people coming into the country, that's for all to see. We can see it by the statistics that come out quarterly. We can't sustain as a country that number of immigrants coming into the country and provide housing for them all. As I think you said, Adam, that they don't all need housing, and we wouldn't be able to provide that housing if they did. This isn't just a UK problem. We see it across the country. You've just had a new president, for example, in America that's having very similar rhetoric to what we're hearing here because they've got the same problem there. What I would say on this is, as clear as it seems that this immigration can't sustain because of the numbers, one of the issues that we discussed before was the skilled workers that we need in this country as well. And we're not providing our own skilled workers. And a lot of those skilled workers pre-Brexit did come from the EU. And we seem to have lost those as well. So we're now getting a lot of unskilled migrants coming into the country, but we've lost the skilled migrants that were actually developing the housing. So it's kind of, we're on both ends are on the negative spectrum simply because of the decisions made at national government level and then have been trickled down, I guess.
So let's move on to the England devolution white paper, released in mid-December, and there will be implications on the powers that local councils have when it comes to planning and development. But could you just start by just giving us an overview of what the white paper covers and what I suppose the government hopes to achieve with it?
Yeah, definitely. I think where the government is, and I think it has broad support for, is removing power from Westminster and allowing it to trickle down into the regions. We saw the previous government talk about levelling up a lot, and this government have continued with the same rhetoric, but obviously branded it slightly differently. Now, we've seen across the country, whether it be in the West Midlands with Andy Street previously, or in the East Midlands with Claire Ward, regional mayors have been set up, and the white paper that was kind of set out in December, is trying to give those regional mayors much more power and actually say, take power from Westminster, take power from Whitehall, and Claire Ward, you know the East Midlands better than we do, deal with these problems. Here are the powers to do that. I guess the second strand of that is an area like Leicester and Leicestershire hasn't got a regional mayor because our politicians here chose not to include themselves in the East Midlands deal. So the second part of the white paper is, actually, Leicestershire, Leicester, Rutland, we want you to have your own form of devolution so that you can make your own powers, make your own decisions as well with your own powers. So come to us with a solution to that problem. Well, how are you wanting to deal with that? And a lot of the conversations that you may have heard in the press in regards to county council leader putting proposals in, maybe cancelling elections, and some of the conversations we've heard from our members of parliament across the county about going into the city and what that includes comes from that white paper.
With respect to the planning side of things, am I right in understanding that these new mayors would have the ability to call in planning applications? Could you just explain what that means, what the implications are?
Yeah, so at the minute, government or the Secretary of State has the power to call in applications, and that would mean that they can make that decision. They've got the power to make that decision on a specific planning application if it's seen as nationally significant, etc. That will still be the case, but regional mayors will now have that power as well. You've seen in London, actually, that Sadiq Khan has had that power for some time and has actually done that himself on several applications across London when maybe it may have been rejected, but it's significant for London. So he's gone and said, actually, I'd like that to be that one to proceed. So we will see in the East Midlands and potentially in Leicestershire, depending on where we end up, that our leaders, regional leaders here will end up with that power, which I think has its benefits because the infrastructure we need, we've talked about housing, but we've also got issues with roads, trains, energy, etc. It will mean that actually local politicians can't just say no because of specific individual community concerns. It will take a much more wider kind of regional view and will hopefully push forward that growth agenda that the government has. And I think we all understand we need to push forwards.
So it sounds like those new powers will enable local government to have maybe a more long-term perspective rather than the much more like localized issues holding progression back. Is that fair, or do you think you'll still have the same sort of issues?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there'll be still the same issues if we because democracy is a brilliant thing, a fantastic thing, but it means that there's elections every 4 or 5 years, and these issues mean that politicians are either elected or they're not elected, as we have seen here in Leicestershire. So we will still have the same issues because these regional mayors will still need to be elected, and if they've made a massively controversial decision, that will stop them or potentially harm them from getting elected, and or will harm their councils from getting elected for whichever party it may be, and or the district councillors at an even smaller level. And we've already seen kind of the MPs turning against the council for similar decisions and what that has meant kind of for regional kind of relationship building. So it's going to make it even more complicated in some aspects. As I've just said, it's hugely beneficial to a part, but I also think that complication will probably add rather than be taken away. And I think we've spoken at the start that one of the issues with our planning system at the moment is the complication.
Is there any elements of further devolution that you think is kind of most commonly misunderstood within the kind of wider public?
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of rhetoric at the moment about cancelling elections, and I think that's hugely misunderstood. I think purposely
around it's not democratic and
etc. Yeah,
yeah.
Because what the government is genuinely, I think, trying to do is say the current system doesn't work. Let's not spend a load more money on electing a load more politicians that for a system that doesn't work, and let's have a sensible conversation about actually how is best to move this forwards. And I think that is just genuinely what they're trying to do. I can see why maybe people might say, you're behind in the polls, so you want to cancel the elections. I think on a wider issue, people think about devolution and they think about a mayor, and they often think about America and the governors and that situation, which is very different to what we're proposed here. Or they think about Sadiq Khan in London and the situation there with the General Assembly, etc. And again, it would be very different in Leicestershire, and it is very different in the East Midlands. And I think they're probably the two biggest things at the moment that people completely misunderstand about our system. On a separate tangent to that, I think the problem with the system we have and why change is being proposed is because 9 times out of 10, people don't understand the current system that we have. So we have parish councils, district councils, county councils, and now regional authorities. People don't understand what those systems all do, and they don't know who the planning authority is. They don't even know who delivers the bins sometimes. So that is a very, very complicated system in itself. And I hope the government is trying to do is simplify that system so that actually people know who to go to if there's a problem, but they also know who to blame when something goes wrong. And I think that's really, in a democratic country like ours, where we should get to. But it will take a lot of education and taking away that misunderstanding to get there.
So do you think that over time this will make people feel not only have a better understanding, and it's a simpler kind of concept, but people feeling more connected to their local authority and that it more closely represents them?
Yeah, I really talk about powers going away from parish or district councils. And by the way, I think parish councils will end up with more power, so that will be even more localised. But certainly district councils will lose that power and it'll go to a bigger council. But that should simplify the system, so at least people know who makes that decision, rather than I don't even know who my parish councillor is, or my district councillor, or my county councillor, or my MP, or my regional. There's too many politicians in that. And people, it just makes things too complicated for people to understand. So hopefully we get to a system where actually people know who represents them, who to thank when something's good, but equally who to blame or vote out when things go wrong. I think really hope that's where we get to as a country.
Just to round off this section around devolution, obviously I want to bring it round to the housing crisis. You've spoken multiple times about the, I suppose, lack of resource and complexity in the current planning system, and that having an effect on the ability to deliver new housing. It sounds like these sort of more devolved powers is going to potentially ease that burden and simplify it. Would you say that's true? That's going to help the crisis we're in?
I hope so. I think a simplification of the system will mean that you've got more officers in one council rather than 1 or 2 officers in lots of councils, if that makes sense. I hope we get to a system where those applications that are the most important for us regionally are dealt with first, and everything is sped up and the system is kind of sped up so that we can get housing applications through quicker. We can get all applications through quicker, but also that community perspective that we spoke about right at the start in terms of what I do is also still understood, and the community still get a buy-in to every application should they want it, and they know how to buy into an application if they do want to buy into it, because I think that's really, really important. Otherwise we will end up with people turning off to politics and planning completely and just living in this kind of isolation world where they don't really want to get involved because nobody listens to them anyway.
Feel disconnected from it.
Completely disconnected, yeah.
Which is an issue nationwide, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think that will only get worse unless the the system is simplified and people understand where to go, what to do, what they need to do to really have their say.
Obviously, we covered quite a broad range of topics, and which is great. Like I've said at the start, like the idea behind this series is to touch on the edges of the property industry, to help estate agents become more informed. And I think we've definitely achieved that. Appreciate your insights. But do you think there's anything that we haven't covered that is particularly important? Like, for example, in the devolution side of things, something that seems to be missing from the conversation is fiscal devolution. Is there any other aspects like that you think are worth touching on? Got any comments or thoughts on?
Yeah, I think the devolution power situation around devolution is really, really important, and we shouldn't get away from that. However, the financial element is also really important, because what is proposed, nothing really changes. We still pay our taxes in the same way, etc. So whilst ever that is going on, the regional bodies will still struggle for funding, because it will be out of the same funding pot, albeit they may be able to add something onto council tax down the line, etc. But that,
so they need the ability to do that themselves.
I think if we end up in a place where things are much more devolved, we need to end up in a place where fiscally we're much more devolved as well. And I think one of the biggest problems with the previous government and their levelling up agenda was, yes, more financially, more cash was given out locally, if you like, but it all came from central government. So the councils had to apply to central government, which just seems the wrong way round. And actually, it should be up to the councils, the regional authorities, to decide where that cash is spent, rather than saying, yeah, you can have that cash.
Asking for approval. Yeah. For our audience that want to stay ahead of all these sort of changes and keep updated, stay informed, what's the best way to do that?
From a kind of a political perspective, I do think keeping up to date with politics is really helpful on this. I think if you're wanting to get into the planning system, you need to know really what's going on locally, regionally, nationally, because I think that often really helps to get through that process. I think from a Cavendish perspective, we've got a regular updates that go out on our website, so you're more than welcome. Anybody's more than welcome to sign up to that, and we do send regular updates about things that are going off, planning frameworks that have come out, things that are happening regionally, nationally, etc.
And that's cavendishconsulting.com. Yeah.
So that's another way. And I think if you're in the middle of a planning application, or you're thinking about starting a planning application, do engage your local community, because 9 times out of 10, if you do engage your local community, you find a problem that you didn't know existed, but you may have found at the planning committee further down the line. So engaging your community means that buy-in is real, the problems are solved at a much earlier level, and by engaging pre-application, that application process of the council asking for objectors and people supporting is much easier, because you understand really what is coming before it happens. So I think that would be kind of my 3 pieces of advice, if you like.
Brilliant. And just a final closing thought. In your world, in politics, planning, communications, is there anything that you're particularly optimistic or excited about over the coming years?
Yeah, I think, as we've spoken about, on the whole, change is going to be huge. So it's really seeing where that change ends up is exciting. I think we could end up in a very pro-growth country through the planning and through the development sector. But the government really needs to empower that sector to be able to do that. And I think if the government is serious about growth, it starts and it ends at planning, and they really need to understand that and move that forward.
Rhys, thank you very much. It's been really insightful. I appreciate you taking your time out to have this conversation. And if people want to find out more about yourself and Cavendish, then the website's the best place to go, isn't it?
Perfect. Thank you.